Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a room beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, buried so deep beneath the stone and the bones of dead cities that no natural light has ever touched its walls. Down there, past layers of reinforced adamantium bulkhead, past corridors that smell of machine oil and incense, past the silent sentinels in gold who have not moved from their posts in 10,000 years, there sits a machine that is also a throne, and a throne that is also a prison, and a prison that contains the most powerful mind the human species has ever produced. That mind is still working. After all this time, after everything, it is still working, still thinking, still pushing against the darkness with a will that should by all rights have been extinguished millennia ago. And if you could somehow ask that mind what it was thinking about, if you could pierce the veil between ordinary consciousness and whatever strange dimension the Emperor now inhabits, the answer might surprise you. Not strategy, not war, not the armies being marshaled in his name across the galaxy, not the prayers being offered up by billions of souls who believe he hears them, not even the slow grinding collapse of the civilization he spent his entire life building. No, what occupies the oldest mind in human history, in whatever moments exist between the constant battle against the darkness pressing in from the warp, might well be the things he found, the discoveries, the things he pulled out of the dark in the long centuries before anyone called him emperor at all, when he was just a man, impossibly old, impossibly powerful, but still just a man, walking the surface of a world that did not yet know what was coming. Because that is what this is really about. Not the battles, not the wars, not the heresy, not the throne, not the 10,000 years of slow decay that have followed. This is about what one mind found when it went looking, when it traveled to places no human had any right to travel, and came back changed in ways that cannot easily be put into words. The Emperor of mankind was more than a conqueror. He was, at his core, something far older and far stranger. An explorer, a seeker, a mind that spent tens of thousands of years gathering knowledge the way other men gather scars, and what he found out there in the void, in the ancient places of the galaxy, in the depths of the warp itself. Those discoveries are the reason everything in the 41st millennium looks the way it does. So settle in, let the noise of the galaxy fade for a while. Let the bolt of fire and the screaming and the endless grinding weight of grimdark despair go quiet, just for now, because we are going back to the beginning, further back than the Horus Heresy, further back than the Great Crusade, all the way to the very first moments of a being who would eventually shape the destiny of the entire human species. We are going to follow the Emperor into the dark places of the world, and of the galaxy, and of reality itself. And we are going to see what he found there. Some of it is wonderful, some of it is terrifying, all of it matters. Part 1. The weight of a mind that cannot sleep. Before we can understand what the Emperor found, we need to understand what the Emperor was. And that means going back much further than most people think. The Warhammer 40,000 universe gives us a specific date for the Emperor's birth. Around 8,000 years before the Common Era, in a primitive Proto-Hittite village, somewhere along the banks of the Sakarya River, in what is now central Anatolia, a child was born. We know almost nothing about his parents beyond fragments. His father was killed by his uncle at some point during the boy's childhood, according to the law, specifically from conversations the Emperor later had with his custodian tribune Ra Endymion. As recorded in Aaron Dembski-Bowden's novel Master of Mankind, the boy who would become the Emperor witnessed this murder through a vision, approached his uncle afterward and stopped the man's heart with psychic power. He showed, according to his own account, neither sorrow nor malice when he did it, just a cold, clear certainty that what needed to be done had been done. That moment, he said, was when he understood that humanity needed law, order, and a ruler. He was still a child when he reached that conclusion, and from that day forward, he was never anything less than exactly what he had decided to be. But here is the detail that most stories skip past too quickly. The child who was born in Anatolia around 8000 BCE, was not simply a very gifted psyker who happened to live a long time. He was something more fundamental than that. According to the canon lore as established across multiple sources, including the Old Realm of Chaos books and the fandom wiki, the Emperor is described as the collective reincarnation of all the human shamans who possessed genuine psychic ability during the Paleolithic and Neolithic ages of human prehistory. Every wise man, every spirit talker, every dream walker and oracle and seer who had guided the earliest human communities through the terrors of a world they barely understood. As each of them died, their psychic essence did not simply disperse into the warp. Instead, it pooled, gathered, accumulated over countless generations, building up like water in a deep basin until finally there was enough of it to do something extraordinary. What it did was be born. The child on the banks of the Sakarya was not simply one very talented human. He was the distillation of thousands of the most gifted humans who had ever lived, their combined wisdom and power and knowledge compressed into a single physical form that would never age, never deteriorate, never die from old age or ordinary injury. He was a perpetual, a member of that strange and rare subset of humanity who regenerates so efficiently and so completely that they effectively cannot be killed by anything except the most catastrophic and specific forms of destruction. He was the most powerful psyker the human species had produced or would ever produce, and he was born carrying within him, albeit dormant at first, memories of thousands of lives that had never been his own. As he grew, those memories began to wake up. One imagines it as something like pieces of a vast puzzle slowly assembling themselves in the background of a mind that is simultaneously experiencing the world fresh, as a young child does, while also being haunted by echoes of everything that the souls pooled within him had ever known. Lifetimes of experience arriving in fragments, skills remembered before they were learned, languages recognized before they were studied, the shape of the galaxy understood in some deep, inarticulate way, long before there was any scientific framework to put it in. And that early psychic sensitivity, that ability to feel the emotional and spiritual weight of the world around him, gave him something even more valuable than power. It gave him awareness. Even as a child, as a young man, as a wanderer in the ancient world, the Emperor could feel things that no other human was equipped to sense. He could feel the warp. Not in a vague spiritual way, not as a religious intuition, but as a genuine and immediate perception of the psychic dimension that underlies all of physical reality. He could feel the currents of emotion and consciousness that flowed through it. And more than that, he could feel, in a way that deepened over the long centuries, the shapes of the things that lived in it, the things that were beginning to wake up in it, the things that were being fed by human suffering and passion and fear, growing slowly larger, growing slowly more aware, growing slowly more hungry. This is where the story of the Emperor's discoveries really begins. Not on Mars, not in the warp, not on some distant alien world. It begins with a young man sitting very still in the ancient world, psychic senses stretched wide, feeling the shape of a danger that no one else could yet perceive, and making a decision that would determine the entire subsequent course of human history. He would do something about it. He would spend the rest of eternity doing something about it. That is who this man was before he was ever called the Emperor. That is the weight he was born carrying. And everything that came after, every discovery, every bargain, every sacrifice, every loss, flows from that first terrible understanding, arrived at somewhere in the ancient Near East, by a child who had just killed his uncle with his mind and decided that humanity needed to be saved. Part 2. 38,000 years of watching. Here is something the Imperium of man spends a tremendous amount of effort not thinking about clearly. The man they worship as a god spent roughly 38,000 years before the Unification Wars doing almost nothing that would make sense as the behavior of a god. He wandered. He watched. He intervened carefully, selectively, usually anonymously, in the affairs of a species that had absolutely no idea he existed. He was, in the most literal sense, a ghost haunting his own civilization, present everywhere and nowhere, visible to no one, leaving fingerprints on history that would only be recognizable in retrospect, if at all. The lore is not particularly detailed about this period, and that is exactly as it should be, because the Emperor was not interested in being detailed about it. He was careful. Whatever he did during those 38 millennia, he did it in ways that left as little trace as possible. The sources tell us he assumed the guise of many historical personages, traveling among different peoples, sometimes becoming a leader or advisor, sometimes a religious figure, sometimes a pioneering scientist. Horus, in a conversation recorded during the events of the Horus heresy, mentioned that the emperor had lived in Anatolia in his own childhood. According to some tellings, one of the emperor's identities during this era was Alexander the Great, a detail that should stop any thoughtful person cold for a moment, because it suggests that the campaign of world unification that Alexander conducted in the 4th century before the Common Era was not merely the ambition of a mortal conqueror, but the early experimental run of a being practicing on a very small scale, the project he intended to eventually execute on a galactic one. That detail is not confirmed canon in the strictest sense, but it recurs enough in the lore to be worth sitting with. The idea that the Emperor has been rehearsing the Great Crusade in miniature, through chosen proxies or even direct incarnations, for tens of thousands of years. Testing methods, learning what works, learning what fails, discovering over and over again what humans will follow and what they will resist, what ideas catch fire and what ones die in the telling. But the wandering was not merely political education, it was something more essential than that. The Emperor during this period was gathering something much harder to quantify than tactical knowledge. He was gathering understanding of the warp, of how it worked, of how it related to the physical world and to the emotional and psychic lives of the humans moving through that physical world. Over the long centuries, as his own psychic power deepened and refined itself, his sensitivity to the Imperium grew correspondingly more acute. He could feel, with increasing precision, how the acts and emotions of living beings rippled outward into the warp, how suffering created particular kinds of resonance, how joy created others, how war and conquest and fear and rage fed certain shapes in the warp that were, over the centuries, becoming less like ambient energy and more like entities with coherent identity. He watched the chaos gods being born, not the dramatic sudden emergence that the mythology tends to imply, the slow geological process of it, emotions pooling over millennia into proto-entities coalescing into something approaching awareness, awareness thickening into something approaching intention, Horn assembling himself from the accumulated violence and bloodlust of every species that had ever killed anything anywhere in the galaxy. Nurgle crystallizing from the grief and despair and the acceptance of inevitable decay that permeated the warp as civilizations rose and collapsed and were forgotten. Tzeentch threading himself together from ambition and hope, and the constant longing for change that characterized every thinking being that had ever looked at the world and decided it should be different. The Emperor watched this happening and understood what it meant in a way that no one else was positioned to understand. He understood it because he himself was a psychic entity of comparable scale, not identical in nature, not formed of darkness and corruption, but comparable in terms of raw psychic mass and presence. He could feel these entities, the way a large predator can feel another large predator moving through the same forest. And what he felt was not just threat, though the threat was real and immense. What he felt was a relationship, a structural relationship between the warp and the physical universe that was more intimate, more reciprocal, more dangerously intertwined than any human had ever come close to grasping. The Chaos Gods are not invaders from outside. That is the critical thing the Emperor understood that almost everyone else in the 41st millennium has managed to get wrong. They are not alien forces attacking the material universe from some external dimension. They are the material universe's own reflection, given weight and hunger and malevolent awareness. They are made of the same psychic energy that lives inside every thinking being that has ever existed. Every scream of rage that Khorne feeds on began as something happening in the real world, in a real person, in a real moment of genuine emotion. Every act of despair that nourishes Nurgle's vast garden was once a real experience of loss or defeat or exhaustion. The Chaos Gods are consequences. They are what happens to the psychic residue of consciousness when it accumulates without guidance, without structure, without the possibility of resolution. The Emperor understood this during those long, wandering centuries. He understood it with a clarity that must have been both illuminating and utterly isolating, because there was no one he could explain it to. Not meaningfully, not in a way that would be believed or acted upon. He was one person watching the slow-motion genesis of catastrophe playing out across geological timescales, armed with complete understanding and essentially no ability to stop it through ordinary means. The ordinary means were not sufficient. He would need something extraordinary, several things extraordinary in fact, and to find them, he was going to have to go to places that no human had any right to survive. The wandering was not pointless. During those 38,000 years, the Emperor was also building, quietly, persistently. He was finding other perpetuals, the rare individuals who, like himself, had been born with the extraordinary regenerative gift of effective immortality. He gathered them around him over the long centuries. Some joined willingly, drawn by his vision or simply by the recognition of a kindred kind of person. Some refused. Some actively opposed him, seeing in his grand designs a hubris they could not forgive. But he kept gathering, kept building, kept maintaining the loose network of extraordinary individuals who were, in a sense, his first and most essential team. He was also, during this time, developing his psychic abilities to their absolute limit, not as a weapon, or not only as a weapon, but as a perceptual instrument. He was using the expanding range of his psychic senses to map the warp in a way that no one else had ever attempted, learning its structure, learning its currents, learning the locations of particular concentrations of psychic energy, particular landmarks in that immaterial dimension, particular weaknesses and particular strengths in the barrier between the warp and real space. He was building, over decades and centuries and millennia, a mental map of the galaxy's invisible architecture. And some of what he found on that map would eventually lead him to discoveries that would change everything. The 38,000 years of watching are easy to dismiss as prologue, as background, as the part of the story before the story starts. But they are not that. They are the foundation on which every subsequent decision was made. Every discovery the Emperor made later, the dragon on Mars, the gate at Molech, the device buried in the Asian desert, the architecture of the webway, was only comprehensible to him because of what he had learned during those long centuries of quiet witness. A shorter-lived, less patient mind would have blundered through those discoveries without understanding them. The Emperor understood them because he had spent nearly 40,000 years building up the context in which they could make sense. Patience, in the case of the Emperor of mankind, was not a virtue, it was a strategy, the longest and most deliberate strategy in the history of the human species. And when the time finally came to act on it, he moved with the certainty of a man who had been preparing his entire life for exactly this moment, which, in the most literal sense possible, is precisely what he was. Part 3. The Dragon in the Dark. At some point during those long millennia of wandering, the lore is deliberately vague about when, citing different accounts that place the encounter anywhere from the early centuries of the Common Era to much earlier, the Emperor found the dragon. This needs some careful setup, because the Dragon of Mars is one of those pieces of 40K lore that sits at the intersection of several different traditions and mythological frameworks, and doing it justice requires some patience with the deep history of the galaxy it comes from. 65 million years before the 41st millennium, approximately the same period during which the non-avian dinosaurs were going extinct on the real-world Earth. The galaxy was in the final, catastrophic phase of what is called the War in Heaven. This was not a metaphorical conflict. It was a genuine, galaxy-spanning war between two categories of entity so far beyond the human experience that their existence barely registers as conceivable from our vantage point. On one side were the Old Ones, an ancient, patient, possibly reptilian species who had been the galaxy's masters for so long that their civilization predated the existence of most of the stars humans can currently see. On the other side were the Necrons, a race of metal warriors who had traded their organic bodies for mechanical immortality, and their C'tan masters. The C'tan are the relevant detail here. They are what happened when the raw energy of the newly formed universe, in the earliest epochs of creation, developed a kind of rudimentary awareness. They were beings of living light who drifted between stars, feeding on the electromagnetic radiation of suns, vast and formless and ancient, in a way that makes even the Old Ones look recent. When the Necrontyre, the mortal ancestors of the Necrons, a short-lived and deeply miserable race cursed by the radiation of their home star, encountered the C'tan and gave them bodies of living metal called necrodermis, these energy beings gained the ability to interact with the physical world in ways they never had before. And then they discovered that the raw souls and biological energy of living creatures tasted far better than solar radiation ever had. So began the War in Heaven. The Necrons and their C'tan masters against the Old Ones, and the psychically powerful young species the Old Ones had engineered to fight for them, including the ancestors of what would become the Aeldari, the Krork, forebears of the Orcs, and eventually, in the most distant and indirect way, humanity itself. The war lasted millions of years, and it destroyed most of the galaxy's infrastructure in the process. It ended not in clean victory for either side, but in mutual catastrophe, the Old Ones broken and gone or transformed into something unrecognizable. The C'tan shattered into fragments and enslaved by the very Necrons they had used as weapons. And all of it capped by the emergence of the Enslaver Plague, a horror born of the psychic wounds the war had left in the warp that nearly sterilized the galaxy of all complex life. Among the C'tan who survived this catastrophe, at least in some form, was the entity known as Magaladroth, the Void Dragon, called the greatest and most terrible of the star gods in multiple sources, called the most technologically advanced of the C'tan, the one most deeply connected to mastery of the material realm, the one whose understanding of physical reality was so complete that he could reshape the functioning of machines simply by being near them. The Void Dragon's warriors, according to Aeldari mythology, were nearly invincible. His control over technology was absolute. During the War in Heaven, the pylons of Blackstone that the Necrons used to suppress psychic powers and try to sever the material universe from the warp, those pylons were partly his invention, his contribution to an attempted solution to the problem of the warp's growing instability. When the Necrons revolted against their C'tan masters and shattered them into fragments, the Void Dragon was among those dealt this fate. But at some point, the lore is unclear about exactly when or how, a significant shard of Magaladroth ended up on Terra itself. Wounded from his war against his own kind, weakened, the entity hid on humanity's homeworld and waited for a better moment that never came, because the Emperor found him. The memories of the entity's guardian, a series of psychically extended humans chosen by the Emperor to watch over the dragon's prison and maintain its bindings, preserve fragments of what happened. These accounts are filtered through layers of guardian memory and should be taken with appropriate caution, but the shape of what they describe is consistent. The Emperor encountered the dragon somewhere in the ancient Near East. Various memories place this at different historical moments, including what may have been the Roman imperial period, with the Emperor at the time taking the guise of a soldier serving under the Emperor Diocletian, a historical echo that is either genuine memory or the kind of mythological encoding that accumulates around events of enormous psychic weight. The fight, according to these accounts, was real. Scales that shone silver and moved like liquid mercury. A creature whose breast still glowed faintly with the light of stars it had devoured across geological ages. A physical confrontation between the most powerful human psyker who had ever lived and an ancient, wounded, but still incomprehensibly powerful shard of a god. The Emperor won. More precisely, and this detail is crucial, the Emperor did not kill the dragon. He himself later acknowledged, according to the sources, that killing it was beyond him. The dragon, even as a fragment, even diminished by its millennia of hiding and the wounds of the Seatan civil war, was a physical entity of such fundamental power that genuine death was not a realistic outcome. What the Emperor could do, what he did do, was bind it, imprison it, wrap it in constraints powerful enough to hold it in place, while he decided what to do with it next. What he did with it next is one of the most elegant and disturbing pieces of deliberate strategic manipulation in the entire history of the 41st millennium. He transported the dragon to Mars. We do not know the precise mechanics of this transportation or exactly when it happened, whether before or after the Age of Strife. But what we know is that by the time the Great Crusade was getting underway, the dragon was definitely there, sealed beneath the Noctis Labyrinth, in the cave system known as the Noctis Labyrinthus on the Martian surface, held in a Necron-built stasis tomb, and the Emperor had left a guardian there to maintain the bindings, specifically a Terran woman named Dahlia Cythera, who had been transformed into a perpetual herself specifically for this purpose. Her lifespan extended indefinitely so she could spend eternity watching over a sleeping god. Now here is the extraordinary part. The dragon, even in its bound and sleeping state, was not inert. It was dreaming, and its dreams, the idle, ambient psychic and technological radiation of one of the most technologically gifted entities that had ever existed, seeped upward through the Martian rock and into the minds of the humans who had been colonizing Mars since the dark age of technology. Those humans, already technologically sophisticated, already inclined toward a reverence for the machine that bordered on the religious, found their aptitudes deepening in ways they could not entirely explain. Their understanding of technology became almost intuitive. The boundary between engineering and mysticism began to blur. They began to speak of the machine god, the Omnissiah, as a genuine divine presence dwelling somewhere in the Martian soil, blessing them with insight and capability. According to Adept Semyon, one of the earlier guardians, the Emperor had planned this. The dragon's dreaming was not an accident or an unforeseen side effect. The Emperor had specifically placed the dragon on Mars because he understood that its ambient influence would seed the development of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the vast technological priesthood that the Emperor would later need to build the machinery of the Great Crusade. He used a sleeping alien god as a cultural inoculant. He created an entire civilization's spiritual framework as a deliberate byproduct of an imprisonment he had to perform anyway. Sit with that for a moment. The Emperor had defeated a Seatan shard, recognized that he could not destroy it, carried it to Mars, sealed it in a prison, and then leveraged its unconscious influence to bootstrap the most important technological organization in the history of the human species, the Adeptus Mechanicus. With all their gene-altering devotion to the machine, their uncanny ability to coax function from technology that should have been beyond their comprehension, their religious veneration of a presence they believe dwells in Mars itself. They are, in a very real sense, the Emperor's most sophisticated long-term investment. And the capital he invested was a bound god. The dragon itself was not destroyed. It is still there, as of the 41st millennium, still sleeping beneath the Noctis Labyrinth, still dreaming its technological dreams into the minds of the Mechanicus acolytes working above it, still bound by the Emperor's ancient constraints, maintained now by the guardians who have passed the duty down across the centuries. There are those in the lore who speculate about what happens if the Golden Throne finally fails, not just for humanity's ability to navigate the warp, but for the bindings on the dragon. Without the Emperor's psychic will anchoring those constraints, would Magaladroth wake? And if it woke, Would it remember that it was angry? Nobody knows. Nobody particularly wants to find out. What matters for our purposes is what this discovery tells us about the Emperor as an explorer and strategist. He found something genuinely, cosmically dangerous. He could not destroy it. So instead of leaving it somewhere it might be accidentally released, or trying to destroy it through means that might not work, he put it somewhere useful and made it do something constructive while it was being contained. He found a way to turn a problem into a tool. He did not waste the dragon. He spent it. That is the Emperor's way. Nothing he encountered in his long exploration of the galaxy was simply a problem to be solved or a threat to be eliminated. Everything was also raw material. Everything was also an opportunity. Even the things that terrified him. Part 4. The one-way ship to the edge of the galaxy before the Unification Wars. Before the Emperor picked up the sword that would carve an empire from the bones of a fractured Earth. Before any of that, at some point that various accounts place in roughly the 20th millennium, perhaps 10,000 years before the Horus Heresy, the Emperor did something that should be impossible to understand, given everything that came before it. He got on a ship, a one-way ship, a vessel that carried him and a small group of other perpetuals away from Terra, away from the homeworld he had been tending for 30,000 years or more, to a planet called Molech. The details surrounding this journey are among the most hotly discussed and carefully dissected pieces of lore in the entire Horus Heresy framework, and with good reason, because what the Emperor found on Molech and what he did there carries implications that reverberate through everything that comes afterward, including the heresy itself, and including the 41st millennium that the heresy made. Molech is a night world. Its civilization survived even the worst of the Age of Strife, more or less intact. Its population kept safe by the Night Houses, who served as the hereditary defenders of the planet's jungles and settlements. On the surface, it looks like a fairly ordinary, if pleasant world. 4 major continents, vast jungles filled with the kind of oversized predatory fauna that night pilots apparently find great fun to hunt. A stable civilization with deep roots. Nothing about it, in the ordinary course of events, would have drawn the attention of a being like the Emperor. But there was nothing ordinary about what lay beneath it. Under the cave networks of Molech, unknown to virtually everyone on the planet's surface, there existed a portal into the warp. Not a natural formation of the kind that psychers sometimes tear accidentally by overextending their powers. Not a chaos corruption eating away at the boundary between dimensions. Something built, deliberate. A gate into the realm of chaos itself, placed there by some hand or intelligence that the lore declines to identify with certainty. The Emperor had somehow become aware of this gate, perhaps through his millennia of psychic mapping of the galaxy's invisible architecture, perhaps through information left behind by the Old Ones, who were the original masters of the webway and who had a level of understanding of dimensional engineering that dwarfs anything humanity has ever achieved, perhaps through some other avenue entirely that the surviving records do not preserve. Whatever the source of his knowledge, he gathered his companions, including the perpetual Olivia Sorica, who would later become one of the more well-documented figures in the Horus Heresy novels, and he made his way to Molech in a one-way voidcraft. The detail about the ship matters. He came to Molech in a vessel. He and at least some of his companions returned to Terra without it. The ship was left behind, eventually becoming the foundation for a vast fortress the Molech colonists would call the Dawn Citadel, a fortress built around the Emperor's arrival point, a monument to the day a being who might as well have been a god landed among them. But the Emperor himself, and some of his companions, teleported back to Terra from the surface of Molech, demonstrating that his power, after whatever happened in the warp gate, was sufficient to cross interstellar distances through the Imperium directly, without the need of a ship. What happened at the gate? The canonical record is deliberately incomplete, and the incompleteness is itself telling. The clearest account we have comes not from the Emperor himself, who never spoke publicly about what happened at Molech, but from a demon who told the story to Horus during the events described in the novel Vengeful Spirit. A demon, An entity whose entire purpose is manipulation and deception, speaking to a man who was already in the process of being corrupted past the point of reason. The Emperor, in other words, made sure the only detailed record of what happened at Molech came from a source whose credibility is essentially zero, and whose motivation to misrepresent events is absolute. That is not an accident. What the demon told Horus was this: the Emperor entered the warp gate and, within the Imperium, forged a bargain with the Chaos Gods themselves. In exchange for something, the terms are never specified with certainty, he was given the knowledge required to create the Primarchs. The 20 superhuman demigods who would later lead his great crusade were possible, according to this account, only because the Emperor went into the most dangerous place in all of creation and made a deal with the very entities he spent his entire life opposing. Is this true? Partially, probably, but the demon's framing almost certainly misrepresents what actually happened in ways that serve Chaos's purposes. The more careful interpretation, favoured by many readers and supported by the broader lore, is something like this. The Emperor already had the raw genetic and scientific knowledge needed to create the Primarchs. What he was missing was the understanding of how to imbue those created beings with genuine connections to the warp, how to give them the psychic heritage and warp-resonant souls that would make them what they needed to be. That knowledge, the knowledge of warp soul crafting, was precisely the kind of esoteric information that only beings who lived inside the Imperium would possess. The Emperor went into the gate to learn, not to beg, not to serve, to extract information from entities who could not refuse him in his own house. He was, in short, the anathema, the Chaos God's greatest natural enemy, the single entity in all of creation most fundamentally opposed to their nature, walking into the very heart of their realm and demanding what he came for. And he came out. That last detail is the most astonishing. He went into the warp gate. He emerged. He was not corrupted. He was not subverted. He was not consumed. The Chaos Gods, who had managed to touch and corrupt every other being who had ever gone near their power, got nothing from the Emperor. He took what he needed and left. And when the demons later described him to other beings, the word they used, the word by which Chaos knows the Emperor even in the 41st Millennium, is the anathema, not an enemy, not an opponent, an anathema, something fundamentally, constitutionally incompatible with everything they are, something that cannot be touched by them because it is made of exactly what they are not. He broke the bargain too. Whatever terms had been agreed upon, whatever the Chaos powers thought they were getting in exchange for the knowledge the Emperor extracted from them, he did not pay it. He took the knowledge and went home and spent the next several thousand years preparing to use it, and the Chaos Gods were left with nothing except the slow-burning plan to take it back through his children. Because if they couldn't corrupt the father, perhaps they could corrupt the sons. But here is what often gets lost in the discussion of Molech and its political implications and its role in the Horus heresy. The most important thing about what happened there is not the bargain, real or alleged. It is what the Emperor found when he went in. He found the inside of the warp, the genuine, unfiltered interior of the realm of chaos, not as glimpsed through psychic projection or perceived through the distorting medium of a ship's Geller field, but directly, personally. He stood in the Imperium and experienced it as a place, as a dimension with its own geography and logic and inhabitants. And in doing so, he acquired something that no human before or since has had access to: direct empirical knowledge of what the warp actually is. He had understood it theoretically from the outside for tens of thousands of years. He had mapped its currents and watched its entities coalesce and tracked the relationship between mortal emotion and warp substance.
Actually, let me just stop here for a second, because this is the part of the Emperor's story that I keep coming back to personally. Like, you can read all the lore, you can go through all the heresy books, the Index Astartes, all of it. And the thing that keeps landing for me is how lonely this all is. He spent 38,000 years figuring out how to save a species that didn't even know it needed saving yet. No one to consult, no one who could even begin to understand the scale of what he was working toward. Just him and the dark and the knowledge of what was coming. I find that genuinely haunting in a way that a lot of fictional tragedy doesn't manage to be. It doesn't feel like drama, it feels real, it feels like the kind of weight that could quietly crush most people, and he just carried it for millennia. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
But understanding something theoretically and experiencing it directly are different kinds of knowledge. At Molech, the emperor learned the difference. He went into the enemy's house and walked through its rooms and came home understanding things about those rooms that no external observation could have taught him. Some of that understanding, the understanding of how to build warp-resonant souls into genetically engineered demigods, he used immediately, in the creation of the Primarchs. Some of it he would spend the next 10,000 years using in other ways, in other projects, in the slow accretion of plans and counterplans that constitute the Emperor's approach to the problem of humanity's survival. And some of it, perhaps the most important part, is what drives the activity that the Imperium of the 41st Millennium calls the Emperor's ongoing war against the warp, the thing he is still doing on the Golden Throne, with whatever is left of his consciousness after 10,000 years of that grinding, impossible labor. Olivia Sorica, the perpetual who accompanied him to Molech and was left behind to guard the warp gate when the Emperor returned to Terra, would later say, according to her appearances in the heresy novels, that the man who came back from inside the gate was not quite the same as the man who had gone in. Not corrupted, not changed in any way that could be easily identified or articulated, but altered in the way that anyone is altered by direct knowledge of something that previously existed only as theory. He understood now what he was dealing with. He had looked at it directly, without the insulation of distance or metaphor, and what he had seen there must have confirmed everything the long millennia of watching had suggested, and added new dimensions of urgency to a project that was already the most ambitious thing any human being had ever attempted. The gate at Molech was eventually discovered by Horus during the heresy, after regaining his suppressed memories of having visited the planet with the Emperor during the Great Crusade. Memories the Emperor had deliberately removed from his mind, along with the minds of all the other Primarchs and soldiers who had accompanied him. Horus led a massive invasion force to claim for himself the power that he believed his father had taken unfairly. He went into the gate. He came out considerably more powerful than he had gone in, but he also came out already corrupted, already committed to the course of action that would end with both himself and the Emperor destroyed in the ruins of the Vengeful Spirit's bridge. The Emperor had expected this. He had expected all of it. The gate at Molech was not just a place where the Emperor had made his bargain. It was also a trap, set with extraordinary patience and foresight, designed to lure whoever rebelled against him into claiming power in a way that would make them predictable. And Horus walked into it, because how could he not? Because the Emperor had made the secret of Molech just discoverable enough to be found, and just attractive enough to be worth seeking, and just powerful enough to seem like it would change the outcome of the war. It did change the outcome of the war, just not the way Horus thought. Part 5. The Machine in the Desert while the Emperor was in the middle of the Unification Wars. The long, bloody, occasionally glorious process of conquering the fractured techno-barbarian warlordships that had divided Terra for centuries during the Age of Strife. He found something beneath the ground. This is a detail that tends to get swallowed up by the drama of the Unification Wars themselves, and by the even larger drama of everything that comes after. But it deserves its own careful attention, because the object the Emperor found beneath the Asian deserts of Terra is arguably the single most consequential piece of physical technology in the entire history of the Imperium. More than the bolter, more than the Gellerfield, more than the gene seed vaults beneath the Imperial Palace. What he found was the core of what would eventually become the Golden Throne. The sources are careful about the exact nature of this device's origin. The fandom wiki and lexicanum both note that the core of what would become the Golden Throne dated back to at least the Dark Age of technology, and possibly even earlier, and that even the Emperor himself was not entirely certain whether the idea for the device was originally his own, or whether what he discovered in those sunken ruins had served as inspiration that he later believed was his original thought. The psychic nature of the device, built from an unknown type of psychically reactive, gold-complected alloy, means that its relationship to human consciousness was not purely mechanical. It might have been influencing the perceptions and memories of anyone who came near it, including the Emperor. What is certain is that he found it buried under a huge and inhospitable desert on the Asian continent of Terra, in sunken ruins that suggested habitation had once existed there and then been forgotten, perhaps long before recorded history, perhaps during the earliest phases of the Dark Age of technology, when humanity's civilization had been at its most expansive and most experimental before the catastrophic collapse of the Age of Strife. The ruins were old enough that nothing of the civilization that had built them was recoverable. Whatever people had constructed this device and this complex around it had been gone for so long that not even the longest-lived historians of the Unification Wars era had any record of them. When the Emperor first engaged with the core device, when he first sat in it, or placed his hands on it, or in some way made psychic contact with it, what he found was a portal into the webway. This is the moment when his long project began to snap into focus. He had known about the webway for a long time. He had known about it the way any sufficiently well-read and broadly experienced student of galactic history would know about it, as the vast, ancient trans-dimensional transport network built by the Old Ones, and later expanded and monopolized by the Eldari civilization, a labyrinthine dimension sitting between real space and the Imperium, partitioned off from both, accessible through gates located on various worlds across the galaxy, a system of transit that bypassed the warp entirely, that required no navigator, that carried no chaos risk, that allowed travel between gates in a kind of no time, that made interstellar distances essentially irrelevant. He had known this as a fact. What he discovered in the Asian desert was something more specific and more electrifying than any fact. He discovered that beneath the ruins, buried under centuries of sand and silence, there was a connection point, a gate into the webway, on Terra itself. Not a conventional Eldari gate, the standard portals through which the Eldari had been moving around their empire for millennia, but something else. Something that appeared to have been built during the Dark Age of technology, specifically to allow human access to the webway network, built by someone, or for someone, who had understood what the webway was, and had constructed a mechanism by which a human mind of sufficient power could maintain an active connection to it. The device was incomplete, or damaged, or simply ancient beyond the capacity of any available technology to immediately comprehend. It required restoration, modification, a vast amount of additional engineering before it could do what it was theoretically capable of doing, but its potential was unmistakable and extraordinary. With this device, properly restored, a human psyche of sufficient power could hold open a stable portal into the webway from Terra. From that portal, human engineers could build an extension of webway corridor that would connect Terra to the existing Eldari webway network, and from that connection, the entire labyrinth dimension could, in theory, be open to humanity. The implications of this were so vast that they require a moment to genuinely absorb. The webway, fully accessible to humanity, would mean the end of the warp as humanity's only avenue for interstellar travel and communication. It would mean that the Chaos Gods could no longer use warp transit as a vector for corruption and possession and demonic intrusion. It would mean that the Navigator Guilds, the mutant hereditary caste whose psychic ability to perceive the Astronomicon beacon was the only thing keeping warp travel viable, would become unnecessary, and the enormous political and economic power they wielded as the gatekeepers of interstellar commerce would vanish. It would mean that the Imperium would gradually be starved of the psychic energy it needed to sustain the Chaos Gods, as humanity's footprint within it shrank from the overwhelming presence of billions of warp transiting souls to essentially nothing. The Emperor understood all of this in the moment he found the device, or he came to understand it over the weeks and months of careful study that followed. Either way, From the moment the device was discovered, his long-term plan crystallized. The webway was the answer, not the immediate answer. There were steps that had to come first. The unification wars, the Great Crusade, the conquest of the galaxy, the establishment of the Imperium as the framework within which the work could be done. But the ultimate answer, the final move in the game that he had been playing since he was a child in ancient Anatolia. He kept the discovery secret, even from the Primarchs, even from most of the custodians who were his most trusted servants. He brought the device to what would become the Imperial Palace, had it installed deep in the subterranean levels below his gene laboratory complex, and began the long process of preparing it for use. He found a second similar device later, during the Great Crusade, a prototype or test version that the sources called Dark Glass, which gave him additional information about the original device's design and intended function. And when the Great Crusade had advanced far enough that he felt he could step back from its day-to-day leadership, he appointed Horus as War Master and returned to Terra to begin the work that mattered more to him than any military campaign. He called it the Webway Project, the Great Work, and he told almost no one what it was. The secrecy was strategic, not paranoid. He was genuinely concerned about the Navigator Guilds, the hereditary Psyker clans who maintained monopolistic control over interstellar navigation and who would see their entire civilization made redundant if humanity gained access to the Webway. He was concerned about the Aeldari, who still used the Webway themselves and who would not welcome the prospect of sharing it with a species they regarded as dangerously psychically untrained. He was concerned about the Chaos Gods, who had every reason to sabotage any project that might eventually sever humanity's psychic exposure to the warp. He was right to be concerned about all of these things. The project was ultimately destroyed by the least expected and most tragic form of sabotage. Not a Navigator conspiracy, not an Aeldari intervention, not a direct assault by the forces of chaos. It was destroyed by the best intentions of a son who loved him. But that comes later. Before the destruction, there was the dream, and the dream was magnificent. Part 6. The architecture of the impossible dream picture. If you can, the scale of what the Emperor was attempting, not the Great Crusade, vast as that was, with its 1,000-ship fleets and its legions of superhuman warriors and its centuries of grinding, relentless conquest across the galaxy. Not that. Bigger than that. The Webway, as the sources describe it, is not merely a transport network. It is a dimension, a genuinely separate dimension, partitioned off from both real space and the Immaterium by means that are still not fully understood by anyone in the 41st millennium, built from materials that cannot be replicated with any currently known technology, maintained by the ambient psychic resistance that those materials generate naturally, and that prevents the chaos entities of the warp from penetrating its structure. The Aeldari didn't build it. Their civilization is ancient, but not ancient enough. The Old Ones built it, the same beings who seeded worlds with life across the galaxy, who engineered species to be living weapons in a war against the Cetan, who possessed the kind of cosmic engineering capability that makes the Adeptus Mechanicus's greatest achievements look like children arranging rocks. The Webway is their work, and it is enormous. It spans the entire galaxy. It connects thousands, potentially tens of thousands, of worlds through gates that allow transit without warp exposure. The Aeldari used it to build and sustain their civilization for millions of years. Even now, in its partially abandoned and partially degraded state, it is the primary infrastructure underlying what remains of Eldari civilization across the craft worlds, and the entire hidden city of Komorrah sits within it. A vast metropolis in a pocket of webway space that the Drukhari have carved out for themselves. What the Emperor found beneath the Asian desert was a human-built connection to this galactic architecture, or perhaps more precisely, a device that could create such a connection, a portal that, when powered by the psychic energy of a sufficiently powerful psyker, could establish a stable gateway into the webway from Terra. The device itself was of Dark Age of technology manufacture, meaning it was at minimum several thousand years old when the Emperor found it, and had been sitting in those buried ruins, inert and unregarded, for all that time. Restoring it and deploying it was a project of staggering complexity over a period of several standard centuries, beginning during the Unification Wars when the device was first discovered, continuing through the early Great Crusade, and accelerating significantly after the Emperor returned to Terra. Tens of thousands of Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests and servitors worked in the vast underground complex beneath the Imperial Palace, known as the Imperial Dungeon. They were building new sections of webway corridor, not in the Eldari material, which they could not replicate. Instead, they built human corridors of ordinary materials and relied on the Emperor, sitting on the golden throne and holding the portal open with his psychic power, to maintain the shielding that kept those corridors from being penetrated by warp entities. This is the hidden cost that is almost never discussed when people talk about the Webway project. Every day the Emperor sat on the golden throne during the Great Work. He was not available for anything else. He was not leading the crusade. He was not overseeing the governance of the Imperium. He was not meeting with his primarchs or guiding his generals or attending to the 1,000 other demands that the master of a growing galactic empire has to manage. He was sitting on a throne in a room that almost no one was allowed to enter, holding a psychic shield around corridors being built in another dimension, doing it continuously because if his concentration slipped, even briefly, the results would be catastrophic. Even at full power, maintaining the shielding for the human-built webway sections was described as one of the most demanding tasks he had ever attempted. It consumed him. It consumed years. The Eldari noticed almost immediately when the Emperor first opened the portal and his workers began moving into the webway. The Eldari, who still used the webway extensively and who monitored their ancient network for intrusions, responded by sealing off their own sections. They closed the portals leading to their craft worlds, preventing any possible Imperial access to the parts of the network they still controlled. They were not going to share their inheritance with these upstart humans, but they also, notably, did not attempt to directly oppose the project. Perhaps they were curious about what the Emperor was attempting. Perhaps they simply watched and waited, the way Eldari tend to do, to see if the humans would manage to destroy themselves before the situation required direct intervention. The workers in the webway built their corridors, and then they built more corridors, and then, gradually, an Imperial presence began to take shape in that strange in-between dimension. Not the ancient, organic-looking structures of the Eldari webway, but something more angular and utilitarian. Human-made architecture in a space that had never seen anything like it before. At the center of the Imperial extension sat what the sources call Kalistar, the Impossible City, an abandoned Eldari city that the Imperial forces made into a base of operations, reoccupying structures that had been empty for unknown centuries and transforming them into something new. The Emperor's plan, as he explained it in the most complete account available, a series of conversations with the custodian tribune Ra Endymion recorded in the novel Master of Mankind, was phased. Phase 1. Establish the portal and build the initial connection. Phase 2. Extend the corridors until they connected to the existing Eldari network, allowing human access to the full webway. Phase 3. Use the webway to replace warp travel for all of humanity, gradually withdrawing the species from the Imperium. Phase 4. The deepest and least discussed. With humanity safe inside the webway and no longer feeding the warp with its psychic presence, begin the guided evolution of the species towards something more. A psychic humanity, not the dangerous, uncontrolled psycho-humanity that the Age of Strife had produced, but something purposeful, developed, capable of engaging with the Imperium on its own terms, with full understanding of the risks and full capacity to manage them. The Eldar, he told Ra, had evolved psychically, and it had destroyed them because their psychic development had been unguided, uncontrolled, allowed to spiral into excess and ultimately produce a god from their collective appetites. He intended humanity's psychic evolution to be different, managed, structured. The webway was the container that would keep the process safe while it happened. The Imperial truth, the rationalist, atheist philosophy of the early Imperium, was the cultural framework that would prevent the kind of spiritual excess that had destroyed the Eldari. It is, depending on your perspective, either the most ambitious and far-sighted plan ever conceived by a mortal mind, or an act of extraordinary hubris from a being who thought he could personally supervise the evolution of an entire species. Possibly both simultaneously. The Emperor acknowledged in his conversations with Ra that it required him to essentially become the de facto god that he explicitly refused to be called, not in the religious sense, but in the functional sense. Someone had to manage this process. Someone had to hold the shields and guide the evolution and prevent the catastrophes that unguided development would produce. That someone, by the sheer necessity of being the only entity powerful enough and long-lived enough to do it, was him. This is the loneliness of the Emperor's position that almost never gets adequately articulated. He was not a tyrant because he enjoyed power. He was not secretive because he distrusted everyone around him for petty reasons. He was doing what he was doing because from his perspective, informed by tens of thousands of years of watching and exploring and discovering things no one else knew, there was genuinely no one else capable of doing it. He was not arrogant so much as accurately self-assessed. And the accuracy of that self-assessment, combined with the weight of what he was trying to do, and the isolation that the doing of it required, is one of the more genuinely tragic elements of the entire story. But something was about to go very wrong. Part 7. The son who broke the dream, his name was Magnus the Red, the Primarch of the Thousand Suns, the 15th Legion. The most psychically gifted of all the Primarchs, a being whose natural talent for perceiving and manipulating the warp exceeded that of almost anyone except the Emperor himself. Copper-skinned, cyclops-eyed, towering even among his superhuman brothers, Magnus was everything a scholar could wish to be. Brilliant, endlessly curious, deeply devoted to learning, capable of insights that left other brilliant minds standing still in his wake. He was also, in the specific way that the most gifted people sometimes are, catastrophically unable to know when to stop. The Council of Nicaea, the great debate held during the Great Crusade about whether the Space Marine legions should be permitted to use psychers and sorcery in their ranks. Magnus argued passionately for the continued use of psychic powers. He was probably right on the merits. The use of controlled psychic ability in disciplined warriors is less dangerous than uncontrolled psychic ability in ill-trained civilians, and the benefits to the crusade were real. But the Emperor ruled against him. The Edict of Nicaea banned the use of psychic powers and sorcery within the legions, ordered the disbandment of librarious departments across the chapters, and specifically curtailed the kind of deep warp exploration that Magnus had been pursuing for years. Magnus ignored the edict, not with malicious intent. That is the important thing to understand about Magnus. He continued his sorcerous investigations because he genuinely believed he could handle what he was working with, and because the knowledge he was accumulating seemed too important to abandon simply because an authority figure had told him to. He was the most gifted psychic being in the Imperium outside the Emperor himself. He believed he knew what he was doing. And then, during what would become the opening phase of the Horus Heresy, Magnus had a vision. In his meditation on Prospero, he perceived, with the clarity that only his extraordinary psychic gift could provide, the truth of what was happening to Horus, the corruption, the turn, the coming war that would tear the Imperium in half. He saw it all, clearly and specifically, and understood that he had to warn his father immediately. Astropathic communication would be too slow, he decided, and besides, a warp storm was apparently blocking the normal channels. So he did what any phenomenally gifted, but perhaps not entirely wise psychic entity might do in that moment of panicked certainty. He cast a spell. He sent his astral form blazing through the warp toward Terra. He hurtled through the immaterium with his warning. He found the psychic barrier surrounding the Imperial Palace, the wards the Emperor had constructed with extraordinary care around the most sensitive and delicate psychic construction in human history, specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of intrusion. And because Magnus was Magnus, and because in that moment he was frightened and certain, and just barely clever enough to be dangerously wrong about his own abilities, he accepted the assistance of a warp entity he encountered inside those wards, an anonymous voice whispering an offer of additional power. He took the power, he breached the barrier, he burst into the Emperor's throne room with his warning intact, and in doing so, he shattered the Emperor's work. The psychic wards he broke were not just protective barriers, they were structural components of the Webway project's shielding. The moment they cracked, the carefully maintained psychic seal on the human-built Webway corridors failed. Warp rifts, the sources call them Magnus's folly, tore open throughout the tunnels. Demons poured in. Thousands of Mechanicus workers in the corridors were killed in moments by entities that should have been permanently excluded from the Webway's space. The golden doors of the portal beneath the Imperial Palace, which had stood open for years of careful construction, suddenly became a direct opening into the warp from the deepest levels of the Imperium's most heavily defended installation. The Emperor, in the moment he understood what had happened, saw something clearly. We know this because of what he told Ra Endymion, and because of what later sources suggest he said to other confidants. He understood, in that instant, that the future he had been working toward for centuries was gone. The Webway project, as he had designed it, was finished. The corridors could not be rebuilt quickly enough. The demons could not be driven out without abandoning all the progress that had been made. The portal had to be closed and held closed, and the only thing powerful enough to close it and keep it closed was him, sitting on the golden throne, pushing his psychic will against it continuously for the foreseeable future. For the foreseeable future turned out to mean forever. The Horus heresy broke out, consuming the custodians and sisters of silence who had been fighting in the Webway in a desperate rearguard action. The war raged for years, with the Emperor unable to leave the throne, because leaving it even briefly would allow the demonic forces to push through the portal and reach Terra. He held on while the galaxy burned. He held on while his sons killed each other and his civilization tore itself apart, and the Chaos Gods celebrated victories they had been patient centuries to see. He held on until the very moment when holding on and ending the heresy required the same action, abandoning the throne, just for long enough to confront Horus aboard the vengeful spirit. Malkador, the Sigillite, sat on the throne in his place for those hours. A mortal man, the second most powerful human psyker of the age, but still mortal, holding closed the gate to the abyss by pure stubborn will. He died for it. When the Emperor returned, broken and shattered by his confrontation with Horus, Malkador relinquished the throne and died with the last of his strength spent keeping the galaxy from ending. The Emperor, too damaged to survive without mechanical assistance, was placed on the throne permanently, and there he has sat ever since, not doing what he intended to do when he found the golden device in the Asian desert, not guiding humanity safely through its psychic evolution via the protective architecture of the Webway, just holding the gate closed, just keeping the lights on, just surviving 10,000 years and counting, while the civilization around him decays into exactly the superstitious, chaos-haunted, fear-ridden mess he spent his entire life trying to prevent. The dream of the Webway was not destroyed by an enemy. It was destroyed by love. By a son's panicked, well-intentioned, catastrophically misguided attempt to help his father. Magnus did not know about the Webway project. He had no idea what he was breaking. He only knew that his father needed to hear what he had learned, and he found a way to make sure his father heard it. The Emperor, from his throne, understood immediately what had happened and what it meant. And then he went back to holding the gate closed, because what else was there to do? Part 8. The fundamental discovery. What the galaxy told him about itself. We have talked about the dragon, about Molech, about the golden throne and the Webway. These are the Emperor's most famous discoveries, the ones that shape the practical course of everything that followed. But there is a deeper discovery that underlies all of them, something the Emperor found not in any specific physical location, but in the accumulated understanding of all his long exploration and witness. To approach it properly, we need to think about what the warp actually is. The Imperium, the warp, is described in the lore as a dimension defined by psychic energy. It is the realm of thought and emotion made real, the sum total of all consciousness from every thinking being in the galaxy, reflected and accumulated and twisted into something that can be visited and experienced, and that has consequences for the physical world whenever those boundaries become thin or permeable. Every emotion that has ever been felt by any thinking creature anywhere in this galaxy has left its mark on the warp in some form. Every dream, every act of violence, every moment of grief, every flash of hope, all of it accumulates in the Imperium as a kind of psychic residue that takes on substance, and eventually, when enough of it pulls in compatible ways, takes on identity. The Chaos Gods are the most developed and most powerful examples of this process, but they are not the only examples. Demons are the same kind of thing at a smaller scale. Fragments of psychic energy given enough coherence to have a kind of personality and agency. The warp currents that make navigation perilous are this same energy in more chaotic, less organized form. Even the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon the Emperor has been broadcasting from the Golden Throne for 10,000 years, is a construction of this same material, shaped by his will and maintained by the sacrifice of thousands of psykers into something that functions as a lighthouse in an ocean of noise. The thing the Emperor understood, the deepest thing, the foundational discovery that gives everything else its context, is that the warp is not an external threat. It is not something happening to humanity from outside. It is something that humanity and every other thinking species in the galaxy is doing to itself. The Chaos Gods did not come from somewhere else. They grew from inside. They are crystallizations of everything that sentient life has thought and felt and desired and feared, concentrated and given agency. They are consequences, results, outputs of the process of consciousness itself at galactic scale. This means that the galaxy's fundamental problem, the thing that makes the 41st millennium so relentlessly dark, so resistant to resolution, so grinding and hopeless in its ongoing catastrophe, is not a war that can be won by conventional means. You cannot kill a Chaos God the way you kill an enemy. You cannot bomb a warp entity into non-existence. The Chaos Gods exist as long as the emotions that feed them exist, and those emotions exist as long as conscious life exists. And eliminating conscious life to stop the Chaos Gods from feeding is not a solution. It is the thing the Chaos Gods ultimately want. The death of everything. The final silence of all the voices that debate their existence. The Emperor understood this with a clarity that no one else in the history of the Imperium has managed to articulate quite so precisely. What he understood was that the problem is structural. It is built into the relationship between consciousness and the warp. The only possible long-term solution is not to eliminate either consciousness or the warp, which are both impossible, but to change the relationship between them, to restructure it so that the psychic energy of conscious life no longer pulls into destructive shapes, so that the warp is informed by consciousness but not dominated by it, so that the Chaos Gods starve not because thinking beings have stopped feeling emotions, but because the emotional energy of those beings is processed and expressed in ways that don't leave toxic concentrations available for ancient predators to feed on. This is why the Emperor believed in the imperial truth, the rationalist atheist philosophy of the pre-heresy Imperium, not because he was a nihilistic materialist who thought the warp was an illusion. He knew perfectly well it was not an illusion. He had been inside it. He had felt the weight of its entities against his psychic senses for 40,000 years. He believed in the imperial truth because he understood that the religious veneration of the Chaos Gods, the worship of them as genuine deities, the surrendering of human will to them as divine authorities, was the most efficient possible way to feed them, and because he also understood that the worship of him as a god was nearly as dangerous, for similar reasons. a galaxy full of people directing their deepest emotional energies toward the Emperor, would create, in the warp, an entity associated with the Emperor. And the entity it would create might not be something he could control, or that would serve his purposes. He was not wrong. By the 41st millennium, the faith of billions has created exactly what he feared. The Star Child, the embryonic psychic entity being gestated in the warp from the accumulated faith energy of Imperial subjects. It may eventually be the Emperor's rebirth, or it may be something else. Something that wears his face, but is not quite him. The lore is deliberately ambiguous about this, but the seeds of it were sown by the very thing he spent his life trying to prevent, the transformation of him into a religion. The Chaos Gods knew all of this from the beginning. They understood the structural relationship between consciousness and the warp because they are products of it. They are inside that relationship in a way that mortal minds are not. They could not corrupt the Emperor directly because he was constitutionally immune to them. But they could corrupt the circumstances around him. They could corrupt his sons, his servants, his civilization, the project he had spent centuries building. They could take the most well-intentioned acts of loyalty and love, like Magnus's desperate psychic warning, like Horus's ambition and hurt, and turn them into vectors for the destruction of everything the Emperor was trying to accomplish. The Emperor knew this was possible. He saw it coming, in the general shape, if not in the specific details. He foresaw, somewhere in his long travels and explorations, that what he was building was going to break, that the galaxy's fundamental structural problem was too large and too deep to be solved in a single act or even a single lifetime, that the project would require more time than the physical circumstances of his existence were going to give him, that he would end up on the throne, trapped, unable to complete what he had started. He did it anyway. This might be the most important thing about the Emperor. He had looked at the depth of the problem. He had understood, through his explorations and his discoveries and his long witness of the galaxy's history, exactly how large and how difficult the task was. He had seen the shape of his own future, at least in outline. He had walked into the warp at Molech and come out knowing that the Chaos Gods were going to come for him eventually, through means he could not entirely prevent. And he had decided to proceed regardless, because the alternative, leaving humanity unprotected in a galaxy that was structured to consume it, was worse. Every discovery the Emperor made in the end led to the same conclusion. The galaxy is dangerous in ways that are deeply structural, not merely contingent. The threats are not things that can be defeated and walked away from. They are intrinsic to the relationship between life and the dimension that life's consciousness creates. The only response is a commitment so vast and so long-term that it makes ordinary human ambition look like a child's afternoon project, an eternal vigil, a perpetual labor, a willingness to sit on a throne for 10,000 years doing a job that was supposed to be finished long ago, because the failure to do it means the end of everything he ever cared about. What the Emperor found in the void was not hope, exactly. Hope implies uncertainty about the outcome. What he found was something more like duty, stripped of all the emotional comforts that normally make duty bearable. Not the warm pride of a warrior defending something precious, not the clean satisfaction of an honest job well done, just the cold, clear understanding of what needed to be done and the will to do it regardless of what it cost. That understanding, that fundamental structural understanding of the galaxy's problem and humanity's role in it, is the deepest discovery of the Emperor's long exploration, and it is the one that has cost him everything. Part 9. The Dead Worlds and the Unanswered Questions. There is a story, preserved in the records of the Logos Historica Verita, and referenced in a handful of secondary sources, about what a single company of lunar wolves found on a world they had just brought into the light of the Imperium during the early Great Crusade. The world was on the outer edge of an explored zone, a place that should have been inhabited if the historical colonization patterns of the Dark Age of technology suggested anything. It should have had settlements, infrastructure, the marks of human habitation going back centuries, possibly millennia. Instead, they found ruins, ancient ruins, far older than any Dark Age of technology settlement should have been. And beneath those ruins, carved into the bedrock by some method that left no tool marks anyone could identify, a map. Not a star chart, not a navigational diagram, an image of Terra itself, from a period so ancient that the continents were in slightly different positions than they occupy today. Terra, as it looked before, recorded history. Terra, as it looked when humanity was still confined to its homeworld and had not yet reached for the stars. The Lunar Wolves commander reported the discovery to Horus. Horus reported it to the Emperor, and the Emperor gave an order that has never been adequately explained in any of the surviving records. He ordered the world destroyed, exterminatus, no survivors, no salvage, no further investigation. The question of what was on that world, what the map meant, who had carved it and why, what connection the inhabitants of that long-dead outer world had to prehistoric Terra, is one that the Emperor apparently did not want answered. Or more precisely, it is one he apparently already knew the answer to, and that answer was dangerous enough that he preferred the mystery of a destroyed world to the risk of the knowledge being found by people who weren't him. This is not an isolated incident in the lore. The Emperor, throughout the Great Crusade, encountered things that he dealt with in ways that left no record, gave no explanation, and permitted no further inquiry. Some of these decisions resulted in entire worlds burned. Others resulted in objects secured in the Imperial Palace's most restricted vaults, never to be examined or discussed. Others resulted in people, entire populations, sometimes quietly removed from the historical record. None of this is to suggest the Emperor was simply a tyrant cleansing inconvenient truths. The pattern, when you look at it carefully, suggests something more considered and more specific. The things he destroyed, or sealed away, or silenced, were almost always things that related to the deep history of the galaxy, to what had existed before humanity, to what the galaxy had been during the war in heaven and after, to the scars and relics of civilizations so old that their existence challenges the comfortable mythology of human preeminence. Things that, if widely known, might have either destabilized his project or provided knowledge to his enemies that he preferred they not have. He was curating history, not cynically, not out of personal vanity, but strategically. The same man who had found the dragon on ancient Terra and made it into a tool, who had gone into the heart of the Chaos Realm and extracted knowledge without paying for it, who had located a portal into the webway in a buried ruin and recognized immediately what it could be used for. That same man, moving through a galaxy full of ancient ruins and forgotten horrors and buried relics, was constantly making decisions about what could be safely known, what needed to be secured, and what had to be destroyed because its existence was simply too dangerous to permit. The dead world with the map of ancient Terra is one of the more poignant instances of this pattern, because whatever that map meant, and the theories range from evidence of pre-strife colonization networks to something much older and stranger, remnants of the old one's work, or connections to the Citan and the war in heaven. It was something the Emperor chose to erase rather than explain. He had the power to explain. He had the authority to tell Horus, or anyone else, what the map meant and why it mattered. He chose not to. That choice tells us something important about the Emperor's state of mind during the Great Crusade. By that point in his impossibly long life, he had discovered so many things that most humans were not equipped to safely understand, had made so many decisions based on knowledge that he could not share without creating more problems than he solved, that the habit of secrecy had become something more than tactical caution. It had become a kind of loneliness. The loneliness of a being who knows too much to be entirely comfortable sharing what he knows, who has learned to carry knowledge the way other people carry weapons, close, carefully concealed, deployed only when absolutely necessary, and always with full awareness of the damage they can do. The Primarchs felt this. Multiple Horus Heresy novels address the frustration of demigod sons, who could feel that their father knew more than he was telling them, who suspected that the plans they were executing were steps in a larger plan they were not permitted to see, who resented the treatment of themselves as instruments rather than as the sons and trusted confidants they believed themselves to be. The heresy, in a profound sense, grew from this rupture, from the impossible distance between a mind that had found too much to easily share and children who needed to be trusted to be trustworthy. He could not bridge that distance. Perhaps he could not bridge it because the discoveries themselves made it impossible. How do you tell your son that the galaxy is structured to consume him? How do you explain to a being as proud and powerful as Horus that the plan he's executing is partly a trap for himself? That the Emperor has looked far enough forward to know that some of his sons will break, and that the breaking is part of the plan? How do you share the discoveries of Molech and the dragon and the Asian desert, and 40,000 years of watching civilizations grow and be consumed, in a way that a brilliant but ultimately young and mortal-spirited mind can hold without being broken or radicalized by the weight of it? The Emperor, perhaps, could not. And the galaxy has been paying for that inability ever since. Part 10, The Throne and the Silence, 10,000 years of consequence. Here is where we are now. Here is where all those discoveries lead. Beneath the Imperial Palace, in a room that no one without the highest clearance will ever see, the Emperor sits. Or rather, the remains of his physical body are held in a state that is neither life nor death by the mechanisms of the Golden Throne, the same device he found in the Asian desert during the Unification Wars, now repurposed from the instrument of his grand project into the life support system of a dying god. His body was shattered in the confrontation with Horus 10,000 years ago, limbs destroyed, internal organs failing, every system that should maintain human life refusing to function. Only the mechanisms of the Golden Throne and the sheer incomprehensible force of his own will keep anything functioning at all. But functioning it is. 10,000 years. 10,000 years of holding the portal closed against the demonic pressure that has been building on the other side since Magnus cracked the wards. 10,000 years of simultaneously broadcasting the Astronomicon, the psychic lighthouse that allows navigator-guided warp travel, that keeps the Imperium's vast network of communication and transit from collapsing into incoherent isolation. 10,000 years of soul-binding thousands of psychers each day, the constant labor of processing and stabilizing the most dangerous members of a species that is becoming more psychic with each generation. 10,000 years of fighting an ongoing war in the warp itself, maintaining the psychic defenses of terror and pushing back against the constant attacks of entities that have had a very long time to accumulate resentment. He does all of this simultaneously, on the throne, in a body that should have died 10,000 years ago, fed on the souls of roughly 1,000 psychers per day. The black ships and their grim harvest, the terrible ongoing sacrifice that keeps the Golden Throne's mechanisms powered and the Emperor's physical shell functional enough to maintain consciousness. The discoveries he made in his long exploration, the dragon on Mars, the bargain at Molech, the Golden Throne from the Asian desert, the webways architecture, the nature of the Chaos Gods as consequences rather than enemies. All of them feed into this moment, this 10,000-year moment, this ongoing labor that was supposed to be temporary and has instead become permanent. He found the dragon and imprisoned it to bootstrap a technological civilization he would need. He went to Molech to get the knowledge to build the demigods who would lead his armies. He found the Golden Throne to build the highway that would save humanity from the warp. He explored the webway to understand what his legacy could become. He discovered the nature of chaos to know what he was really fighting. And now he sits on a device that was supposed to be a tool and has become a prison, holding a door closed that was supposed to be a doorway and has become a barricade, in the ruins of a plan that was supposed to unite humanity and has instead produced the most dysfunctional and self-destructive empire in the galaxy's history. Or has it? This is the question that the 41st Millennium cannot stop asking, the question that hangs over everything in this setting like smoke. Has the Emperor failed, or is the Imperium, grimly, terribly, at enormous cost, still slowly moving towards some version of the goal he was working toward, are the 10,000 years of horror and sacrifice, the necessary labor of a transformation that is still underway, is the constant pressure of existential threat that the Imperium faces somehow the mechanism by which humanity is being forged into something that can survive in this galaxy. The law does not give us a clean answer. It is not that kind of law. But there are hints. The psychic awakening, the increasing number of unusually powerful psychers being born across the galaxy, the deepening connection between human consciousness and the warp that makes every generation slightly more psychically sensitive than the last. A trend that could lead to catastrophe the way Aeldari excess led to catastrophe, or could, under the right guidance and structure, lead to something that looks more like what the Emperor always said he was trying to build. He is still working. This much seems to be canon, or as close to canon as anything in 40K gets. The Emperor on the Golden Throne is not simply a body being kept alive by machines. He is a consciousness that is still engaged, still fighting, still pushing back against the darkness in ways that his servants can occasionally perceive, and that his enemies must constantly contend with. He guides through the tarot. He intervenes in individual psychers' development in ways that seem to express deliberate intent. He keeps the lights on, literally, in the form of the Astronomicon, for a civilization that would collapse without them. Whether this constitutes hope depends on what you are comparing it to. The discoveries he made in his long exploration of the void are not wasted. The dragon is still on Mars, still dreaming its technological dreams into the Mechanicus, still being held by bindings that the Emperor established and that somehow have not failed even after 10,000 years of the Emperor's attention being divided among 10,000 other things. The knowledge from Molech, whatever it was and whatever it cost, produced the Primarchs, and however many of them fell, the ones who remained saved the Imperium at the Siege of Terror and have continued to shape its history ever since. The Golden Throne, for all the tragedy of how it ended up being used, is doing a job that needs doing. The Webway project failed, but the understanding behind it, the understanding that humanity's relationship with the warp needs to change structurally, not just tactically, the understanding is not lost as long as the Emperor's consciousness continues. What he found in the void was a galaxy shaped by a war fought 65 million years before his birth. A galaxy still carrying the scars of that ancient conflict in everything from the Necron tomb worlds to the warp's instability, to the existence of the Cetan shards, to the slow accumulation of psychic energy that is producing the Chaos God's growing power. He found that the stakes of everything he was doing were not merely political or military, but genuinely cosmological, not about which empire ruled which planets, but about whether the relationship between consciousness and the warp could be shaped into something that permitted life to continue indefinitely, or whether the galaxy was going to slowly consume itself the way a body consumes itself in the final stages of a fatal illness. He found, in short, that the universe is very old, very dangerous, very deeply structured in ways that resist simple solutions, and that the only appropriate response to that knowledge is a commitment so comprehensive that it admits no limits of time or cost or personal sacrifice. And then he committed, with everything he had, for as long as it takes, 10,000 years and counting. Closing, the light that refuses to die. Every time a space marine charges into battle and shouts, "For the Emperor," they are invoking a name that belongs to a man who has been sitting on a throne for 10,000 years, doing work that most of them will never understand, for reasons that most of them could not articulate even if they tried. The faith is real, the protection is real, the light of the Astronomicon is real, but the god they worship is also a man who got on a one-way ship to the edge of nowhere because he needed to know what was in the warp. A man who fought a silver-scaled being on the surface of ancient terror and won. A man who sat in an alien dimension and held a psychic shield around human-built corridors for years because he believed it was the only way to save his species from itself. The grimdark of Warhammer 40,000 is often described as hopelessness dressed in gold and brutality, and there is truth in that description. The Imperium is a horror show. The galaxy is consuming itself. The solutions to the galaxy's problems are still nowhere in sight after 10,000 years of the Emperor's ongoing labor. But there is something else in the story of the Emperor's discoveries that resists the full weight of that hopelessness. Something that refuses to be simply nihilistic about what he found and what he chose to do with it. He found a galaxy shaped by ancient structural catastrophe. He found that the things threatening humanity were not contingent problems that could be solved with sufficient cleverness, but fundamental features of how reality at this scale functions. He found, at Molech and on Mars and in the Asian desert and in the long centuries of watching, that the universe is darker and stranger and more dangerous than almost any human being has ever been equipped to understand. And he decided to understand it anyway, to carry that understanding, to act on it without the comfort of certainty about the outcome, to hold the line not because victory was assured, but because the alternative was to not hold it. That is what the Emperor found in the void. Not a way to win, not a clean solution, not even a guarantee of survival, just the understanding of what needed to be done and the will to do it, at a scale and duration that most minds could not sustain for a single lifetime, let alone 10,000 years and counting. Whether that is enough, whether it is hope, or just an endless holding action against inevitable entropy, that is the question the 41st millennium will not stop asking. And perhaps that is exactly where it should be. If you made it this far into the dark corners of the Emperor's story and found something in it worth thinking about, let me know in the comments what aspect of this lore hits the hardest for you. The dragon on Mars, the deal at Molech, the webway dream and how it ended, or something else entirely. There is so much more in every one of these threads that we could spend entire videos on each one alone. And if enough of you want to go deeper into any of them, that is exactly where we will go next. If this kind of deep, atmospheric 40K lore is what you come here for, then subscribing to Q on 40K and hitting that notification bell means you will never miss when we disappear into the void again. Every video we make is made for people who want to sit with the lore and let it breathe, who want to understand the weight of the world rather than just catalogue its facts. If that is you, you are in the right place. The Emperor protects. Even now, even from his throne, the light is still on. See you in the dark. Part 11. The Galaxy Before Humanity. What the Emperor inherited to genuinely understand the weight of what the Emperor discovered in his explorations. You have to understand the galaxy he was exploring, not the galaxy of the 41st millennium, with its Imperium and its constant wars, and its roster of recognizable factions. The galaxy before all of that. The galaxy as it existed before humanity had ever left Terra, before the age of technology, before the Dark Age, before the age of strife. The ancient galaxy shaped by things so much older and so much more powerful than any human civilization that our entire recorded history looks like a brief afterthought scratched on the final page of an incomprehensibly long book. The old ones were the first, as far as anyone can determine. An ancient, patient, probably reptilian species who had been crossing the void between stars before most of the stars visible in today's sky had finished forming. They were not gods, they were mortal, in the sense that their civilization eventually ended, but their command of technology and psychic power was so far beyond anything that has come since that the distinction between their abilities and divinity is largely academic. They shaped worlds, they engineered life, they built the webway, and they seeded many planets with the biological precursors of what would eventually become intelligent life, including, according to some sources, Terra itself, meaning that the old ones may have played some indirect role in the eventual emergence of humanity. Even if they were long gone before any human ever looked up at the stars with the capacity to wonder about them, The Old Ones also made enemies in ways that their patient temperament perhaps prevented them from fully anticipating. The Necron-Tyre, a short-lived radiation-cursed species who had evolved under one of the galaxy's cruelest stars, came to them seeking the secret of immortality. The Old Ones declined to share it, and from that refusal grew a resentment that would eventually become the War in Heaven, and from the War in Heaven grew everything that makes the galaxy what it is today. The Necron-Tyre found the C'tan. They gave those ancient, starborn energy beings physical bodies of living metal. The C'tan, discovering the taste of mortal souls, began converting the Necron-Tyre into the soulless metal warriors who would become the Necrons. The C'tan fed on the living. The Necrons killed. The Old Ones, faced with an enemy that combined the C'tan's godlike physical power with the Necrons' superior numbers and technological sophistication, did what they had always done when faced with difficult problems. They engineered their way out. They created new species designed to be weapons. The Eldari, engineered to be psychically extraordinary. Beings whose connection to the warp was so deep and so powerful that they could wield the Imperium itself as a battlefield. The Krork, the massive biologically engineered warrior species who would become the ancestors of the Orcs, designed to be perfectly self-replicating and indestructible, and pointed toward the Necron threat with the deliberateness of a living siege weapon. Various other species, whose names are now lost or appear only in fragments of Eldari myth, all of them created in the Old Ones' laboratories, all of them released into a war they had not chosen, all of them carrying the legacy of a conflict they had not started. The War in Heaven lasted millions of years. It destroyed most of the infrastructure of the ancient galaxy. The webway was partially breached. The C'tan warred among themselves even as they fought the Old Ones, because their appetites and territorial instincts did not allow for genuine cooperation. The Necrons fought and died and were rebuilt and fought again. The psychically gifted young species created by the Old Ones battled with powers derived from the warp, and those powers were effective. The C'tan, beings of pure physical energy, were profoundly vulnerable to warp-based attacks. But the use of those powers also destabilized the Imperium itself, feeding the growing sea of accumulated psychic energy with the raw material of war and death on a scale unprecedented in galactic history. The war ended not with a clean victory, but with mutual catastrophe. The Old Ones were broken. The C'tan were shattered by the Necron revolt. The Silent King, Zarek, having finally recognized that the gods he had summoned were consuming his people rather than elevating them, organized a rebellion that shattered the C'tan into the fragments that survive today, imprisoned in tesseract vaults or sleeping beneath the surfaces of worlds that once knew the heights of the War in Heaven. The Necrons themselves retreated into the Great Sleep, sealing themselves in tomb worlds to wait for the psychic plague of the enslavers to die away, and for the galaxy to calm itself enough for their next awakening. Into this aftermath, into a galaxy that was ancient and scarred and full of the buried debris of civilizations that had destroyed themselves through conflicts beyond human comprehension. The Eldari Empire eventually rose, inheritors of the Old Ones' legacy, masters of the half-broken webway, a species whose psychic gifts were unmatched among anything that remained alive in the galaxy. For millions of years, the Eldari were the dominant civilization. They rebuilt, they explored, they created art and philosophy and architecture of stunning sophistication. They also, slowly, and then all at once, destroyed themselves in a wave of excess and spiritual catastrophe that produced the birth of Slaanesh, a new chaos god ripped screaming into existence from the accumulated psychic weight of their collective indulgence, tearing open a wound in reality that became the Eye of Terror. The fall of the Eldari, roughly 30,000 years before the 41st millennium, the same event that created the warp storms whose gradual dissipation marked the end of the Age of Strife and cleared the way for the Emperor's Great Crusade. The same event that introduced the fourth and youngest Chaos God into a pantheon that already included Khorne and Nurgle and Sench. The older three having crystallized gradually from the accumulated psychic weight of mortal emotion over millions of years of galactic history. This was the galaxy the Emperor was born into. This was the inheritance he was examining during those long millennia of wandering. A galaxy that had already seen civilizations rise and collapse at cosmic scale. A galaxy whose invisible architecture was shaped by wars fought 65 million years before the first human ever stood upright on Terra's savannah. A galaxy where the evidence of those ancient conflicts was buried on countless worlds, waiting for an explorer patient and perceptive enough to understand what they were looking at. The Emperor was that explorer. He had the time, his near immortality giving him access to spans of investigation that no mortal scientist could manage. He had the psychic sensitivity, his extraordinary gifts allowing him to perceive the residue of ancient events in the warp structure in ways that no amount of archaeological excavation could replicate. And he had, from those thousands of lives pulled within him at his birth, memories and frameworks and instincts that sometimes let him recognize what he was looking at before he had consciously worked out why. When he fought the dragon on ancient Terra, he knew what he was fighting, not from any book or testimony or scientific analysis, from something older, an awareness built into the structure of his consciousness by the collective experience of the shamans whose souls had pulled to form him. They had lived through the residue of the war in heaven. They had felt its echoes in the warp. They had passed on, through the long chain of reincarnation, a kind of deep understanding of the galaxy's nature that arrived in the Emperor's mind, not as specific knowledge, but as a kind of instinct, a recognition, an ability to look at a silver-scaled entity emerging from the ruins of old Terra and know, in the deepest part of his awareness, what category of thing he was dealing with. He was not discovering these things fresh. He was remembering them. The accumulated shamanic wisdom of human prehistory was giving him access to a kind of encoded knowledge that earlier generations of humanity had possessed and passed on through the warp and through the chain of reincarnation. Knowledge of the galaxy's history that had been gathered in fragments across thousands of years of careful, anonymous observation. And what that knowledge told him, consistently and with mounting certainty across all his long years of exploration, was that the galaxy was not merely dangerous. It was dangerous in specific, structured ways. And those structured dangers had specific histories and specific weaknesses and specific responses that could, in theory, be taken advantage of by a being with sufficient knowledge and sufficient will. He had both. He had both in amounts that no other entity in history had ever possessed. And he spent everything he had trying to use them for the benefit of a species that, 10,000 years after the greatest catastrophe of his impossibly long life, is still arguing about whether he was a god, a tyrant, a savior, or simply a very powerful man who made catastrophic errors of judgment in the service of goals that were never going to be achievable in the timescale he imagined. The answer, most likely, is some irreducibly complex combination of all of these things. He was all of them at once. He was a being of such scale and such depth of knowledge and such absolute commitment to a cause that the ordinary categories of judgment, hero, villain, saint, monster, don't really apply. He was something else, something that the 41st millennium still does not have adequate language for, something that found darkness in the void and chose to stand in it anyway, for as long as standing was possible. Part 12. The Things That Cannot Die. Legacy of the Emperor's Discoveries. Let us end, appropriately, not with the Emperor himself, but with the shape of what he left behind. Every major faction of the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy has been touched, in some direct or indirect way, by the discoveries the Emperor made in his long exploration of the void. Not just the Imperium, not just the things that bear his name or carry his gene seed, or pray to his image on the golden throne. All of them. The Adeptus Mechanicus, that vast, eccentric, organ-replacing, logic-worshipping technological priesthood, with their reverence for the machine god Omnissiah, their uncanny ability to coax function from technology that should be beyond their comprehension, their deep attachment to the red sands of Mars as a holy place. All of this traces back to a sleeping entity beneath the Noctis labyrinth. The dragon's dreaming shaped them. The Emperor's choice to put the dragon there and to maintain the bindings that kept it dreaming rather than waking and consuming is the reason the Adeptus Mechanicus exists in the form it does. Without the Emperor's imprisonment of a wounded Citan shard, there might be no Mechanicus at all. And without the Mechanicus, the industrial and technological base that allowed the Great Crusade to succeed and the Imperium to function would simply not have been available. Every starship, every bolter, every suit of power armor, every titan and tank and piece of infrastructure that holds the Imperium together, it all flows at some remove from the Emperor's decision about what to do with the dragon he found on ancient Terra, the Space Marines. Obvious perhaps, but worth stating clearly. Without the knowledge the Emperor acquired at Molech, whatever that knowledge actually was, whatever the real nature of the bargain or the encounter or the direct experience of the warp interior, the Primarchs could not have been created. And without the Primarchs, the gene seed that their genetic material provided could not have been used to create the Space Marines. The hundreds of thousands of Astartes who have defended the Imperium across 10,000 years of war, who continue to defend it in the 41st millennium, who are at this moment dying on battlefields across the galaxy to keep some fragment of human civilization alive. They exist because the Emperor got on a one-way ship to Molech and came back with something he needed. The Navigator houses, the great mutant dynasties who have maintained their monopoly on warp navigation since before the Unification Wars, their power, their wealth, their vast political influence within the Imperium, these are all, in a perverse way, a consequence of the Webway project's failure. If the Emperor's great work had succeeded, if Magnus had never broken the wards, the Webway would have been open to humanity and the Navigators would have become redundant. The Paternova of the Navigators apparently knew this. Sources indicate that the Navigator Guilds dispatched an agent to destroy the Dark Glass prototype during the Great Crusade, recognizing the threat the Webway project represented to their interests. They failed then, but the heresy accomplished what they could not. The Webway closed, the Navigators remained necessary, their power endured. Everything that the Navigator dynasties are in the 41st millennium is, in a real sense, the fruit of the Emperor's failure to complete what he started. The Eldar, the Aeldari, and their relationship with humanity. It is difficult and strange and shot through with resentment and historical grievance on both sides. The Eldari were the original masters of the Webway. They watched the Emperor try to take it for humanity. They sealed their sections when the first Imperial workers entered the tunnels. They have spent 10,000 years watching the Imperium stagger along under the weight of its own dysfunction, and occasionally, very occasionally, they cooperate with it, because the calculations of Aeldari Fasayas sometimes indicate that a living Imperium is more useful than a dead one for the specific purposes the Aeldari are currently pursuing. This complicated, uncomfortable dance of mutual dependency and mutual contempt is, at some deep level, a consequence of the Emperor's discovery of the Webway connection and his decision to try to use it for his own species' benefit without asking the Webway's existing inhabitants whether that was acceptable. The Chaos Gods themselves. They have spent 10,000 years pressing against the portal the Emperor is holding closed. They have spent 10,000 years benefiting from the religion that has grown around the Emperor, feeding on the faith energy of billions of Imperial subjects who worship him in ways he never wanted to be worshipped. They have spent 10,000 years waiting for the Golden Throne to finally fail, for the ancient machine to give up, for the shattered body within it to stop generating the psychic will that keeps everything functioning. They are, in the oldest and most literal sense, invested in the outcome of the Emperor's discoveries. Because the Emperor understood them, he looked at them directly, at Molech and in his long centuries of warp sensing, and he understood what they were. And that understanding, the understanding that they are consequences rather than eternal entities, symptoms rather than causes, is the most dangerous thing in the galaxy, from their perspective, because a problem that is understood can, in theory, be solved, and the Chaos Gods cannot afford to be solved. The Emperor is still working. This is the strange and haunting truth that underlies everything in the 41st millennium. The discoveries he made, the dragon, the bargain, the golden device, the fundamental nature of the warp's relationship to life. These are not historical curiosities. They are live issues. They are things that are still mattering, still having consequences, still shaping the outcome of conflicts that will determine whether the human species survives the next millennium or disappears into the void like so many civilizations before it. He is still on the throne. He is still holding the light on. He is still, in whatever way a consciousness as ancient and damaged and extraordinary as his can be said to still be working toward the completion of a project that was supposed to be finished 10,000 years ago. What he found in the void was a galaxy that wanted to consume humanity. What he found was an enemy that could not be fought with weapons alone, that required understanding and structural change, and the patience to work towards solutions measured in geological time rather than human lifespans. What he found was the specific shape of the danger and some of the specific paths through it. What he gave humanity was a chance, not a guarantee, not a clean victory, just a chance, maintained at extraordinary and ongoing cost by a will that refuses to simply let go and be done with it. Whether that chance is enough, whether the Imperium and the species it was built to protect can find a way to make use of it before the Golden Throne finally fails and the light goes out. That is the question the 41st millennium is living inside. And the Emperor, on his throne, in his silence, with everything he found and everything he knows and everything he is still doing with it, is waiting to see how it turns out. 10,000 years of waiting. A little longer, perhaps, won't be the thing that breaks him. Perhaps. Part 13. The Anathema. What it means to be the enemy of everything. There is a word that the forces of chaos use when they speak of the Emperor. Not the corpse Emperor, which is contemptuous. Not the false Emperor, which is dismissive. The specific word they use among themselves, in the dark councils of the warp and the whispering corridors of the Eye of Terror, is the anathema. And understanding why they use that word, what it means to the entities that use it, gives us, perhaps, the clearest possible picture of what the Emperor truly found at the deepest level of his long exploration of the void. Anathema. It does not simply mean enemy. An enemy is something you can fight, something you can corrupt, something you can bargain with, something you can find a lever inside of and pry apart. An anathema is something constitutionally incompatible with your existence, something that cannot be converted, because conversion requires some shared ground between the converter and the thing being converted. And with the anathema, there is no shared ground, something that cannot be corrupted, because corruption requires that there be something in the target that the corrupting power can latch onto and grow from. And in the anathema, there is nothing to latch onto. Something that cannot even be properly understood, not because it is beyond understanding in the abstract, but because the understanding of it requires a kind of consciousness that the Chaos Gods do not and cannot possess. The Chaos Gods are, at their most fundamental level, emotional entities. They are made of emotion. They think through emotion. They perceive through emotion. They communicate through emotion. When they look at the universe, they see it through the lens of the specific emotions they embody. Rage and violence for Khorne, despair and acceptance for Nurgle, ambition and the hunger for change for Tzeentch, excess and sensation for Slaanesh. Everything else is noise. Everything else is just more raw material for the emotions that define them. The Emperor is not emotional in this sense. Not that he cannot feel. The lore suggests in various places that he experiences something like love and grief and pride and regret. Emotions that mortal beings would recognize as such. But he is not defined by any single emotion. He is not a crystallization of something specific. He is something more like a comprehensive awareness, a consciousness capable of holding multiple emotional states simultaneously without any one of them becoming his defining feature, without any of them becoming the handle by which he can be seized and redirected. He is, in the technical sense that matters most to the Chaos Gods, unmappable. They cannot find the edge of him that matches any single piece of their nature. They cannot find the part of him that is angry enough for Horn to claim, desperate enough for Nurgle to embrace, ambitious enough for Tzeentch to manipulate, excessive enough for Slaanesh to tempt. He went into Molech and faced them, in their own realm, and came out unchanged. This is the thing that is genuinely miraculous about the Emperor. More miraculous in some ways than any battlefield victory or psychic feat or act of political statecraft. He stood in the place where the Chaos Gods are most powerful, where their influence is most direct and most total, where the warp is not an external medium they must project through, but the very substance of the environment, and he negotiated. He took what he needed. He left. They called him the Anathema after that, not as an insult, but as a category, a classification. He is the Anathema because he is the only thing in the galaxy, or at least the only thing they have ever encountered, that is simply constitutionally incompatible with what they are. Not an enemy, not an opponent, a negation, a silence in the frequency they occupy, an absence shaped like a presence. What this tells us about what the Emperor found in his explorations is this: he found himself. Or more precisely, he found the shape of himself in relation to the rest of reality. He found, through the long centuries of examining the warp and its entities and the relationship between consciousness and the immaterium, that he was not merely a very powerful human being. He was something that the universe had produced, deliberately or accidentally through the pooling of shamanic souls or through some deeper evolutionary logic, as a specific response to the specific shape of the galaxy's problem. He was the answer, partial, imperfect, still subject to the limitations of physical form and mortal circumstance, but an answer nonetheless. The galaxy had made him for this, or something in the structure of reality had bent toward making him for this, or the accumulated weight of human psychic history had crystallized around the need for exactly this kind of being and produced him as a consequence. He knew this. We know he knew this from the conversations recorded in various sources, from the fragments of his thought and speech that have survived in the 40,000 lore. He did not experience the knowledge as comforting. It was not the warm, affirming discovery of a cosmic purpose that religious mythology tends to describe. It was more like the recognition of an obligation, a terrible, unavoidable, permanent obligation that he had not asked for and could not refuse, because refusing it meant abandoning the thing he had spent his entire, impossibly long existence trying to protect. He was the anathema, the thing the Chaos Gods could not touch, the thing that stood between them and the consumption of everything they could reach. And he had known, for a very long time, that being the anathema would eventually cost him everything it is possible to cost a being who cannot die in the ordinary sense. Not his life. He could survive almost anything, but his freedom, his capacity to act, his ability to see the project through to its completion rather than being frozen in an eternal defensive posture, holding the barricade, keeping the lights on, doing all the essential but terrible work of simply not letting the darkness win. He accepted this, not with joy, not with dramatic resignation, but with the same cold, clear certainty he had expressed as a child when he stopped his uncle's heart. The thing that needed to be done, needed to be done. He was the only one who could do it. He did it. The anathema sits on his throne, 10,000 years in, still doing the thing that needs to be done. Still constitutionally incompatible with everything that would end the species he decided to protect. On the day he left his village in ancient Anatolia and started walking toward the first city of humanity. That is the deepest thing the Emperor found in the void. Not the dragon, not the warp gate, not the golden device in the desert. Himself, his own nature, his own function, his own inescapable role in the structure of the galaxy's ongoing catastrophe and its still possible salvation. Everything else he found was in service of that. Every discovery was a piece of the answer to the same question. How do you protect a species from a galaxy that is structurally hostile to its survival? The dragon was part of the answer. The bargain at Molech was part of the answer, the golden throne, and the webway, and the understanding of the chaos gods as consequences, all parts of the answer. And underneath all of them, the foundational part, the part that made all the others possible, was the discovery that he was a being capable of being the anathema, a being capable of facing the full weight of the galaxy's darkness and not being changed by it, not being consumed by it, not being driven into despair or corruption or the comfortable numbness of cynicism. He faced it, he understood it, he built his response to it, and then, when the response was broken and the trap he had spent 10,000 years preparing was tripped and his body was shattered beyond repair, and the project was not finished and might never be finished, he got back on the throne and kept going. Not because he was a god, not because faith sustained him or prayer fueled him or destiny guaranteed him a good outcome, because the galaxy needs someone to stand in the place where the darkness is trying to get through, and he is the one standing there. And until the darkness is stopped, or the species is safe, or something else takes his place, he will continue to stand there. That is what the Emperor found in the void. That is what it cost him to find it. And that is what the 41st millennium is still, somehow, still running on. 10,000 years of standing and counting. Outro. The light that refuses to go out. We began this journey with a question, a simple question, deceptively simple, the kind that sounds almost naive when you first say it out loud. What did the Emperor actually find out there? In all that darkness, in all those years of searching before the crusade, and the throne, and the 10,000 years of silence. And now you know, or at least you know as much as anyone can know about a being whose full history is half buried in mythological sediment, whose decisions were made across timescales that make human historical records look like margin notes, and whose innermost thoughts have never been fully recorded by any source we entirely trust. He found a wounded god sleeping under Mars, and he made it a cornerstone of his strategy rather than a problem to be solved. He found a door at the edge of the galaxy and walked through it into the place where the enemy was strongest, and he came back with what he needed. He found an ancient machine in a desert that nobody else had thought to look in carefully enough, and he recognized it for what it was and understood what it could become. He found the true nature of the thing he had been fighting his entire life, understood it not as an eternal external enemy, but as a consequence of consciousness itself, and built his response around that understanding. And in the deepest part of all his searching, he found himself, the shape of what he was, and what he was for, and what it was going to cost him. That is the story of the Emperor's exploration of the void. Not a story of glory exactly, although there is glory in it. Not a story of wisdom exactly, although there is wisdom in it. A story of a being who looked at an impossible situation clearly, understood it in all its depth and complexity and structural horror, decided that someone needed to do something about it, and accepted the fact that he was probably going to be that someone for a very, very long time. He is still there, on the throne, in the light, standing in the gap between what humanity is and what the galaxy would make of it, given the chance. Whether that is enough, whether it has ever been enough, is the question that Warhammer 40,000 refuses to answer cleanly, because it is a question that the real universe also refuses to answer cleanly. Are the things that stand between catastrophe and survival ever truly enough, or do they simply hold on, for as long as they can hold on, buying time for something or someone else to find a better answer? The Emperor found many things in the void. Perhaps the last thing he found, the thing the throne has given him 10,000 years to contemplate, is that he does not know the answer to that question either, and still he holds the light on. Still he sits in the dark and presses back against whatever is pressing through. Still he is the anathema, the thing that cannot be converted, the silence in the enemy's frequency, the answer shaped like a man who chose, long ago in a village in ancient Anatolia, to become something more than what he was born as. The galaxy is old. The darkness in it is older than anything you can comfortably contemplate. The things pressing against the walls of the Imperium have been there since before humanity first stood upright, and they will be there long after the last star goes cold, because they are not dependent on the stars for their existence. But there is a light on the throne. It has been on for 10,000 years. And every day it remains on, every soul it guides through the warp, every prayer it absorbs, and every moment of connection it maintains between a species scattered across a million worlds and something that is still, somehow, still recognizably itself. Every one of those moments is a discovery in its own right, a discovery that endurance is possible, that consciousness can hold against the tide, that the void found something in the Emperor, and the Emperor found something in the void, and the two of them have been in conversation ever since, a conversation whose conclusion we do not yet know, and may not know for another 10,000 years. Thank you for spending this time with me in the dark, exploring the deepest spaces of a universe that rewards careful looking with extraordinary things. If you found this journey worthwhile, if the Emperor's story moves you the way it moves me, leave a like on this video. It helps more people find their way to this channel. And every new voice that joins this community is another light in the dark. Subscribe if you want to keep walking these roads together. There are more stories to tell, more corners of this vast and terrible universe to explore, more questions like this one waiting to be asked and partially, carefully, thoughtfully answered. Drop a comment and tell me, which of the Emperor's discoveries do you find most significant? The dragon, Molech, the golden throne, the nature of the chaos gods, or the discovery of himself as the anathema? I read every comment, and the conversations that happened down there are some of the best discussions in this whole corner of the internet. Until next time, until the next story, the next question, the next long walk through the lore we love. See you in the dark.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.